Well, I want to share with you some personal experience working on emergency and disaster planning. As I read in the recommendation that Diego sent to me before, I am trying to bring you here more than a theoretical approach about what is disaster planning, what kind of things you need to follow to write a disaster plan. I want to share with you some personal and professional experience that I have had working in these issues. No, first of all, I want to say that I have been working maybe since 2017, only in Latin America and in Spain. No, so I have been a long time without enough English practice. So my English must be a little rusty. So if I made some mistake, maybe because my brain still needs some time to switch to English mode. So please excuse me. I will do my best with this. No. So okay, let me share with you some slides that I prepare. No. This presentation, I decided to name it as organizational context consideration in emergency and disaster planning. No, and I want to cover essentially two main aspects. The first one is the title that Diego suggests me to cover, that is focused on the content and format of emergency and disaster plans. No, that will be the most theoretical approach and the most theoretical element that I will offer in here. No, also based in my own experience working as consultant in preparing some disaster and emergency plans. No, but if you see the idea of the content and format of an emergency plan suggests that we will say how you need to write and what will be the element that need to be included in a document that you will present as a disaster plan. And after that, I want to share with you some ideas more in the dark side of what is emergency and disaster planning. No, in this case, I will try to share with you some experience and some ideas that I have learned, not only working as a consultant, but also working in disaster scenarios. No, and well, trying to understand how could be possible, what could be the conditions in which you can plan what could be the response in case of a disaster. No? And after that, I would like to open a space to share some ideas with you. In that space, maybe we can try to identify some main conclusions and recommendations about what we have been saying during this session. No? Well, the first thing that I want to share is about the first aspect that I mentioned before, is what should be the content and how could be the format when we work, when we prepare an emergency or disaster plan. And I would like to share with you four main questions about this initial question that we are talking about. No, when we think in this question about what should be the content and how could be the format of a disaster plan, could be interesting to think in who should be interested in this question, who could be interested in answer what content and what format. Well, it usually is someone who has the responsibility to prepare a plan. And in this case, in my experience, there are two different situations in which someone has this responsibility. The first one, if you are working in an institution, in an organization, in a fire department, in a hospital, and someone, or you decide, okay, I want to have an emergency plan, no? In this case, of course, you will be interested in know what could be the content and the format of this plan. Another situation is if you are hired as a consultant, an institution, an organization, a government ask you, okay, I want you that you help me, I need some advice to prepare my plan, no? The second question is, what do you think that could be expected as a result of this effort? Once that you finish the disaster plan, what specific product do you think that is expected? And usually, the main idea is that people is expecting a kind of written document in any format, but it's something like a book, a guide, no, in which you will find a lot of guidelines and responsibilities and contacts and that kind of information, no? A third question is who could demand the elaboration of this product? And as I told you before, the person that could demand the for an emergency or disaster plan could be a wide range of actors, no? I have worked preparing disaster or emergency plan for the director of a company or an industry, the Petroleum Corporation of Venezuela, people from the government sector, okay, the director of the civil protection of a city, okay. All these actors could ask you for a plan. And what you can see is that you can work working in emergency and disaster plan for a wide range of different actors. And that makes that it's not easy to find an unique format to prepare a plan, because each actor, depending on what they do, where they work, will demand a specific format and a specific content that must be adapted to the others protocols and plans that they used to have, no? So it's not easy to have a single format to write a plan. My experience is that the plan, you can have a general structure. You can follow a general guideline to work when you are preparing an emergency plan. But once that you finish the content that you want to present, you will need to adapt this result to the specific format that is used by your specific customer in a way, no? So it's not easy for me to find a lot of examples of general structure to work in emergency and disaster planning, no? I have found some reference. In my case in particular, I have always used this structure of 6 steps that you see in the right of your screen, no? When I when I work advising.
Perdón, Ale, no sé qué pantalla estás compartiendo, pero vemos la central que tiene las pantallas chiquititas.
Ah, que Sorry, I don't know what's going on. Let me see.
I think you're sharing the wrong screen.
Okay, let me check what is going on. Sorry. What happened? Okay. Sorry, Diego, let me see what is going on. I thought that you were, okay.
Creo que si pones primero para presentar, tipo el modo presentador, y después compartir la pantalla, te da la opción de elegir cuál quieres compartir de las dos.
Déjame ver.
Sorry guys that we are using a little bit of Spanish here.
Okay, now.
The same. Pero si usas esa misma pantalla, podés ir moviéndote para abajo y podemos ver, aunque veamos la pantalla, no la de presentador.
Ok, pero puedes ver la pantalla que tengo abierta.
Sí, es la pantalla en la que se ven las slides chiquititas a la izquierda y la del centro, pero estamos viendo la slide principal con el título.
Ok, ¿y si ahora yo hago esto?
No cambió nada. Ahora sí.
Okay, pero no entiendo por qué razón no puedo mostrar la pantalla en modo presentación.
¿Ya lo pusiste en modo presentación?
¿Está en modo presentación now?
No.
El PowerPoint, Alejandro.
Sí, lo tengo, o sea, yo lo veo en modo presentación. Okay, wait a moment. I think that I got it. And now?
Yes.
Now we are, yeah, good.
Okay, now it's okay.
Yes.
Sorry, I was looking, everything was fine in my computer. I'm so sorry. Well, once again, let me show. Okay, this is the element that we'll be attending in this conversation. The first one is the content and format of emergency and disaster plan. And the second one is, as I told you, we will walk a little in the dark side of disaster planning, thinking in some idea of the theory of chaos and nonlinear dynamic system. Okay, this is the four questions that I was trying to make to the initial aspect that we need to attend, and it's related with what should be the content and how could be the format of an emergency and disaster plan. No, we mentioned about this that who should be interested in this question? Well, someone who has the responsibility to prepare a plan. Okay. The second one is what is expected as a result of an emergency and disaster plan. Well, usually people think that a disaster plan is essentially a written document. People are waiting for a book. Okay. Who demand the elaboration? We mentioned that in my experience, a wide range of factors demand for the elaboration of this kind of product. Okay, you can be the person in charge of a hospital, can be a governor, can be someone that works in the armed force. I have worked advising emergency and disaster plan for the armed force, and each one of these customers, each one of these clients will expect that you present your document in the specific format that they use. Okay, so it means that you won't find a unique form to prepare, a unique format to write an emergency plan. No, what you can have is you can follow a general structure, a general guideline that you use because you feel comfortable with your guideline, no? But once that you finish your product, you need to adapt your result to the specific format that is expected for the customer. I was mentioned that I usually like to work with this guideline that you see in the right of your screen. No, when I have worked in disaster planning as consultant or advising the elaboration of a disaster plan, I usually follow these 6 steps. No, the first one are essentially focused on characterization, on diagnosis. In this case, we work in the threats characterization scenario. We also work in the vulnerability diagnostic. In this case, what we are trying to do is to find where are the weakness of the weak points that we can find in our system that could be more affected in case of the materialization of the preliminary threats that we mentioned. No? From the convolution of these 2 first elements, you can identify a risk mapping, a risk map that will show you in a geospatial way where are the problems, what are the priorities, what need to be done, and where. No? And once that you have these 6 elements, these 3 elements, you can start to define what could be done and following what the prioritary. In this case, what we used to do is that we work in a resource inventory. I mean, a whole resource inventory. It means internal resource of the organization. It means human resource, budget that you can have to intervene some levels of risk that you would like to mitigate, whatever. Then you, in the step 5, work properly in the mitigation and in the response plan. It depends on what what the people ask you to do. Sometimes I have worked in disaster planning, and the focus is in the prospective and correction of risk scenarios. And in this case, the problem is not the response, the optimization of response operations. No? In other case, people ask you is essentially respond. What we need to do once that the earthquake strike, or in the case of a flood or whatever. And something that is very important in my own experience is that it's always very important to include a complete appendix that is focused on specifically in implementation and in quality control methodology. Usually it's important to create some indicators, some guidelines that could lead to the user of the plan, how to know if things is going, how to know if things is going on okay or not, how to know if the goals that you have defined for the plan are getting covered, if you are moving ahead or not. That kind of things are very important. No? I am showing, for example, there is a kind of graphic that we use for a real consultancy that we did for an urban city. They asked us to create an index for quality control to know if they were moving, if they were doing the things okay in the planning for disaster and risk reduction. That this is a consultancy process that we did in the city of Caracas. So this is what I mentioned as a general guideline, to prepare the plan. And once that you have this general guideline, then you can go to the specific content of the final product. And in this case, there is a wide range of different contents that you can prepare. It will depend, as we said before, who is demanding the plan. Unfortunately, we have today a lot of resources, and you can Google in any time. Okay, I'm working in a plan, an emergency plan for a school or for a private business or for a hospital, and you will find a lot of material that will give you a lot of different structures. It's very funny because sometimes you find, depending on who is your customer, some requests that could be really bizarre. I remember some years ago I was working for a general of the Armed Force in one of these countries in Latin America. He asked me to work advising the design of a plan, a response plan of the Armed Force in case of an earthquake in a city, in Latin America. And well, we did all the analysis and diagnostic and the math. And I remember that when we were in the last stage of the project, they gave us a template, a format, in which we need to write all the results, but was exactly the format that they use for the different plans for war and attacks and that kind of thing that they use in the armed force. Well, the stories that they need to write, each one, you need to answer each one of the questions that you have in that document. And was very funny because they say, okay, who present the plan? The general commander of the 16th brigade or whatever, And what is the scenario? Well, the scenario is a destructive earthquake that could affect the city, creating a lot of damage. And they say, who are the allied force, the friends, the friends force that are with us in this mission? And they write the fire department, the civil protection, and the health system and that kind of thing. And they also ask, who are the enemy? And in this case, well, who is the enemy here? And well, finally, we need to write the strong waves of the earthquake that could destroy the city, or the flood that could create a lot of problems in our operational capacity. And there was no way to avoid you need to answer who is the enemy, because well, you are working with the armed force, and well, you need to write something in that part of the document. No matter, that there's no sense to think who is the enemy in this kind of situation. But as I told you before, the customer is the armed force, and so well, you need to prepare a document in a final format that is the format that they use. Okay. So as I told you anyway, there's a lot of very good resource. Particularly, I have been in contact during the last maybe 10 years that the private sector is working a lot in the preparation of plans, and there's a lot of protocols and methodologies. So I think that it's not easy if you have a good diagnosis and a good set of recommendations to transform what you have in your guidelines in a specific format. So that's what I could say in my own experience. The way in which you can define the format and the content that could be included in an emergency or disaster plan. So now, what I want to start with this slide is what happens when the situation becomes more complex. What happens when we are trying to work in an emergency or disaster plan, but that goes beyond what is more typical scenarios that you can confront. And when we ask what happens if the scenario becomes more complex, could also be interesting to say, what do we mean here as complexity? And about this, initially, I want to share with you the idea that the complexity of an emergency plan is somehow related with the number of elements, the number of factors, and the size of the area in which you are designing the plan. In a very initial approach, we could say that the definition of the complexity of a plan is something that you can, yes, you can assume in base, if you think in a rectangle, in a square like this one, no, in which in one X you find the geographic size, the area in which you are doing your plan, you are working with your plan, and in the vertical side, you find the number of actors that could be involved in the plan. Of course, when we talk about the geographical space, we are talking in hectares, in square kilometers, okay? We're talking about a city, a small town, an industry complex, a house, okay? And about the actors involved, we are talking about how different institutional or even non-institutional groups are included in the plan. You can work in a plan where you are only thinking in the fire department or in civil protection or even in the health system, or the people that works in communication or energy or water, and a lot of different elements, no? So in a very preliminary approach to this idea, you can see that in here, we are talking about a plan in which we have two units, let's call it in a general way, of in geographic space, and two units in actors involved. So you could think that we have a complexity of 4, okay? We also could have a complexity of 4, okay? That means it's more or less the same level of complexity if we are talking about a plan that is located in a very small geographical space, but include a lot of different actors, okay? And we also can have the opposite situation in which you have a single actor, okay, but a wide area that is covered. You can find that the complexity of these 3 different scenarios could be more or less the same. For example, I have worked for a national plan in case of disaster for the electric system of a country. Initially, it looks that it's very complex, but the idea is that you are only working with the company, the National Service of Electricity, allow you to prepare sums, okay? But the idea in here is that you can imagine that the product of the size of the area and the number of actors involved can give you an idea of the complexity of the plan in which you are working. And another thing that I want to share with you is that when you have low values of this indicator of complexity, it's better, it's possible to work with what I will show you in a moment, that is what I mentioned as structured or hard plans, okay? What is this idea of structured or hard plans? Well, the idea that is behind this definition is that when you are working in emergency planning or disaster planning, you can move in a wide spectrum of possibilities, okay? In which you can move from hard plans that are plans that are the best option to use when you are working in formal structure that are governed by pyramidal architectures, okay? So hard plans are very good and works very well in hard context, hard organizational context, okay? And in the other side, okay, the dark side of disaster planning, you find what I usually define as soft plans. And what is a soft plan? A soft plan is a plan that is better to be used when you are working with very informal structure, very organic environments, okay? With a strong horizontal articulation, where the leadership is very strange. You can identify clearly who is the boss in here, but you know that there is a kind of networks, okay, between persons there that will need to be part of the response in a particular moment, no? If we try to identify a little with more detail the difference between these two different contexts in which you can promote these two different plans, we can say about hard context, hard organizational context, that our hard organizational context usually are vertical, pyramidal, usually can be identified as disciplined structure, no? The leadership that you find in this kind of context are usually normative, and I am using the definition offered by Max Weber, the German philosopher, no? And the idea here is that the leader is the one who has been designed by a formal law, a formal decision, okay? Who is in charge of the emergency? Well, the commander, because, well, that is the decision of the president or of the government. So the leadership in this case is normative, and that's very important to fix it because it means that will be very easy to know who you need to talk about, who will be taking the decision, because that is defined in advance. Okay? Another characteristic that could be interesting is the control over the behavior of the different actors in the pyramid exists even in the face of dynamic change. The goals are clearly established, are usually established for the top of the pyramid, okay? the commander, the persons in charge, define what we need to be done and where are we going, and that's the way in which the whole system will move. No, there's a permanent and very clear vertical communication channel that is respected by everyone, and you always find a strong capacity of integrate information. You see this capacity usually when you go to the center of emergency operations. No, you go inside of this place and you see a lot of screens and graphic and database and a lot of information in everywhere. That's the way you can see this capacity to integrate information. No, and what happened in the other side? In the other side, the situation is very complex. In the other side, as we mentioned, we are talking about very horizontal structures, very organic systems, okay, where the leadership usually is charismatic. Once again, I'm using a typology of Max Weber, and the problem with the charismatic leadership is that you don't know who will be the ones that say, okay, everybody follow me. You usually don't know exactly who will take that role, no? But the experience, even working in disaster scenarios, this is not only what I have seen working in planning, this is something that I have seen working in case of disaster scenario. Sometimes you find that you need to be coordinating with a woman in the neighborhood that for some kind of magical reason became the leader of the group, no? So in this case, it's very challenging to define how the plan for response at this specific level will work, no? Well, another different aspect is that there is no formal control or mechanism to control the behavior of other actors, no predefined common goals. So the decisions, particularly at the local level, are taken based in a permanent communication and permanent exchange of information, and based in some kind of agreements. People decide to do different things, no? So, well, there's other elements in here, no existing of formal mechanism to integrate information, and permanent decision-making based in a permanent process of negotiation, no? So, these characteristics that you find in soft environments is very hard to include in a typical plan, okay? Because, and we will see in a moment that the reasons are complex, and just a few authors have offered us some ideas about how could be possible to work on disaster planning, because this identification that this characteristic that I'm trying to show with you is more typical in disaster situation. Of course, that we can find points that are in the middle between the hard and the soft scenario. You can find a lot of gray spaces, no? In which you find, well, I am working in an emergency plan that is in an organization that is not so hard as the armed force, but it's not so soft as I don't know, a typical community, no? And in this group of points, okay, where you find some gray areas, I include what is a very common methodology that is used to work on emergency and disaster planning, you know, and is that very common methodology that is referred as the incident command system. No? Incident command system has shown that it's very useful to work it's a very good choice to coordinate the activity of different agencies that respond to a major emergency scenario. Okay, in this case, the methodology is very well described. The FEMA usually promote a lot the use of incident command system, and there's a lot of material and videos and training programs that show how this system works. No, I think that the most relevant, in a very easy way to explain it, the strongest capacity that I have found in the field working with incident command system is this idea to put together all the actors in the same space, to share information, to take a decision, to define a specific responsibility for different actors, and this idea of the permanent capacity of flexibility and adaptation to the different situation. That is, in my opinion, the most valuable aspect of the incident command system. No? But as you see, an incident command system is a way in which you can work when you have a major emergency, in which at the same time you will have teams from the police department and the fire department and civil protection and from rescue groups. So incident command system is a great methodology to create a good coordination between all these actors. But as we mentioned, what happens when the situation goes beyond the emergency, goes beyond even the idea of the major emergency, and when we are dealing with a disaster scenario, a huge disaster scenario? What happening there? Well, to try to offer an answer to this, I would like to could be good to start seeing a little some typical definition of what is a disaster, and try to identify what elements are characteristic in case of a disaster. No, a common definition, or a first definition that we can present in here of disaster is a dictionary definition. No, I took this from the Oxford Language Dictionary, and it says that a disaster is a sudden accident or natural catastrophe that causes great damage or loss of life. Okay. Okay, well, maybe for a general idea could be interesting, but it doesn't seem that is as good as we wish, because this idea to put in the same group a sudden accident or natural catastrophe, maybe we can try for another definition that could be more useful for what we are looking for. No. So let's use the definition of FEMA. And FEMA sustained that a disaster is an occurrence of a natural catastrophe, technological accident, or human-caused event that has resulted in severe property damage, death, and or multiple injuries. So this definition is interesting because it suggests that the characteristic of a disaster is as the severity, the amount of damage, okay? Even in material damage or human damage, but this definition suggests that when we are in a situation in which the damage that is received is severe, we are talking about a disaster. We could think, okay, what could be the definition of natural phenomenon or technological accident that has the severity, okay, of a disaster, that has less severity, okay? What could be the definition of a situation in which the severity is low? You can have 1 or 2 deaths, or I don't know, a few amount of damage in property. And so could it be possible to think in a definition for that specific scenario? A car accident, for example, okay? Or a small fire in a house, in a city. Okay, that of course is a natural or technological event that causes property damage, death, and injury, but maybe it's not so severe as could be a disaster. Well, in this case, we are talking about an emergency. Okay, an emergency is something that happened and that could be attended by the local capacity to attend that kind of non-desired situation, but that painfully happens eventually, you know, with some frequency. So one thing that has been interesting is that during years, people saw on what could be the boundary, what could be the level in which you move from the non-severe effect to the severe effect, and what could be the number, okay? Thinking, for example, in human damage, injuries, okay, or casualties. When we will talk that the level is severe, and when we will talk that the level is not. I remember that during the 60s, I mean 1960s, 1970s, there was a huge debate about these ideas. I remember that during that time, some international agencies that work in this kind of thing decide to mention a number. I remember, for example, that it was said sometime that 20 deaths could be a good number to define what is severe and what is not severe, no? And during years, I don't want to mention the agency, but during years, they say, if you have more than 20 deaths, it's a disaster, and if it's less, it's not. But of course, with the years, with the debate, and with the reflection, people saw that it's very hard to fix a number in that way, because 20 deaths in a very small town could represent a huge event for that very small town. And maybe 20 deaths for a huge city, okay, maybe it's not so severe, okay? So based on that, a definition that were used in, particularly in the 90s. I remember that I used to work in a capacitation program that was killed by the of the Office for Foreign Disaster Assistance of USAID in Latin America, the main definition for disaster that we used was this one, no? Disaster are serious destruction. We can mention it as bad things, okay? To the functioning of a community, but that has a particular characteristic is that this disruption exceeds the capacity to cope its effects with the resource of the own community. So, in other words, a disaster, by definition, exceeds the capacity to attend the damage with the resource that you can find in the affected community, okay? So this is a smart definition, because if you are talking about a small town, maybe a small accident could be a disaster, because this traffic accident could easily exceed the capacity to cope the effects by this small town. And the same could be in a large city where the capacity, of course, will be bigger. But in order to take again what we are trying to presenting here is what could we say when we are talking on disaster response planning. One question that is interesting about this particular definition is when we are talking about the capacity to cope, the capacity to attend the effect, what are we talking about? Initially, the response could be a very, how can I say? The initial answer that you can find in this is essentially a numeric and logistic answer, okay? You can say, well, if you have an emergency in which you need 50 ambulance and you only have 10, you are dealing with a disaster, okay? Or you have more capacity to attend polytraumatized victims in hospital. You need, I don't know, 100 beds or spaces to attend these victims, and you only have 20. You will be dealing with a disaster. But what I want to show and what I want to share with you in the next minute is that the capacity that we are referring in here goes beyond that simple number, no? The first capacity that you lose when you are dealing with a disaster is the capacity to understand in the first minutes the size of the challenge and the complexity of the scenario that you need to attend. And it's very interesting to understand that, because this incapacity to have a whole idea about what is going on is an inner characteristic that define any disaster. So, based on this, we can identify that there are very important differences when you talk about emergency planning and disaster planning. That's why in most of the countries, I can talk about my experience in Latin America. I have been always doing things in the United States, in Canada, in Asia, I have done a few things, and also in Europe. You find that usually you find that there are institutional organizations, institutional structure that work with emergency scenarios and with disaster scenarios, knowing that emergencies are bad situations that happen frequently, that if you sum all the deaths, all the damage, you find that there led a lot of problems, a lot of damage to the city, but they are daily, they are frequent, they are attended by organized mechanisms that are specialized and they respond following protocols that are very well defined. No? When we are talking about disaster, we are talking about extraordinary situation in which it's not easy to think that the capacity that you have to respond to emergencies will solve the problem that you will face when you are dealing with disaster. In an emergency situation, you will see that the typical protocol is that a citizen can see an accident, they call to the 911, somebody will receive the call and will activate a protocol, a mechanism, and they will send, I don't know, a fire department unit or an ambulance or any kind of support. No? The point is that when we are talking about disaster, there is no way to call to the 911 because probably the telephone service won't work or the mobile phone network will be collapsed. And probably you won't have, I don't know, roads to receive the answer. In a disaster scenario, the dynamic is completely different. That's why I always remember that Professor Quarantelli always said that it's very important to understand that a disaster is not a big emergency. A disaster is another thing. Wars following other rules is another behavior, is another scenario. To understand a little the theory that could be behind of this way to understand what is a disaster and how it works, could be interesting to use this basic model about what is a crisis, okay? A crisis, in the theory of what is a crisis, you can identify that there are several moments in when a crisis happens. A crisis is essentially a jump. Something broke in the day-by-day dynamic, and from one moment to another, you are confronting a completely different situation. This broken of the normal situation, you can see it in here in the blue line that was coming in a normal way, and suddenly it breaks. Okay, when it breaks in this point that we call T0. Okay, so the idea is that the system that was living in equilibrium with the previous situation suddenly needs to adapt to a new situation. And this adaptation process is done by, it's a kind of learn by doing process, okay? You are moving, I don't know how can I say por ensayo y error, Diego, but you are moving in a...
Trial and error, Alejandro.
Sorry?
Trial and error.
Trial and error. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, it's a kind of trial
error
process.
You have 7 more minutes, by the way.
Okay, okay, I'm gonna run. So in this case, you will see that you will always find a moment in which you'll be trying to adapt to the new situation. In this point, you find that there's a moment that is the pre-crisis, the crisis properly. In this crisis, there's a moment in which the system comes into a stage of resolution and adaptation to the new situation, and finally a post-crisis where the things are adapted. No, the time that takes to move from T0 to T1 to the post-crisis moment is what we call the time of resolution. And the idea of disaster management and disaster planning is to do as much as possible to minimize the time of resolution of the system. The key is that you need to accept that it won't be easy to find a plan in which you will avoid this kind of chaotic behavior. The chaotic behavior will appear because we are dealing with a disaster. The point is that you need to do as much as possible to minimize this kind of resolution. No, we have worked. Well, I worked some years ago, a long time ago, trying to identify what could be the mathematical fundamentation of this idea. The theory that you find behind this definition of disaster management and disaster planning is you can find it in the theory of chaos and in the principle of self-organization of complex systems. We found, working in a research center of the University of Los Andes, some mathematical models. You can see up here a mathematical model that suggests this behavior that you can see in the lower side of the screen, okay, and try to show how is this kind of response in case of disaster. We don't want to go in too deep in mathematical consideration, but I want to share with you that what we found when we were working in this is that there is a parameter, this parameter phi that you can see here, that defines how fast or how long takes the system to adapt to the new circumstances. And one element that is very important to promote, to reduce this time of resolution is what we call the internal consistency of the elements of the systems. If we take these ideas to what we are talking in disaster management, we could say that what you need to do when you are talking with disaster planning and disaster management is that you need to create the condition, the previous condition in the system that will allow that the chaotic and non-linear response are as strong as possible to guarantee that the time that will take to the system to get into equilibrium again will be the minimum possible. Some actors, a few authors have worked on how you could work in this kind of, to improve this kind of capacities. Because improving this kind of capacity is the only way in which you can do effective disaster planning. Because we're talking about disaster, no? There's an author that I like a lot. She is a wonderful woman. She is Louise Comfort, and she wrote about these aspects. She have a very good, a very nice paper. I want to share it with you by email, Diego, so please share it with the students, no? And what she wrote is called The Element That Impact on Self-Organization of Complex Systems. And she defined 3, 4, 5 things that you can do to guarantee that the response of this complex system in case of disaster will be the best. I mean, that the resolution time will be as short as possible. And a second author that I always mention, and I was blessed because I had the chance to be a student from this eminence on these issues, is Professor Enrico Quarantelli. He is co-founder of the Delaware Disaster Research Institute of Delaware, no? Professor Quarantelli has a very clever document where they suggest what could be the basic criteria to identify that a disaster planning process is successful. He was a sociologist. He never thought in mathematical and dynamic chaos theory, but he said things in 1985. I mean, his ideas, but was very interesting. He said, for example, and I am almost finishing, Diego, that when you work in disaster planning, in difference on what you do when you're talking in emergency planning, the focus is the process and never the writing. A disaster plan don't need to be presented in a document. The document could not, essentially, it's not necessary. The plan is a kind of complex network between actors that need to be built, that need to be created. You need to create spaces in which people talk and share point of view, and all these effort need to be done before the impact. The idea is that if you create these conditions in previous conditions in the system, the capacity of response on the system will be improved a lot. And that will be because the system will have a stronger capacity of self-organization. That's the main idea. I don't have time to go one by one of these 8 points, but there's additionally, I have a document that I will send to you. Probably you have been used it already with your students, Diego, but it's one of these incredible documents that was written by Professor Enrico Quarantelli, no? So, well, that's essentially what I prepare to share with you today as in terms of